I think I can trace back the moment where I wanted to do something in this space, and it was like coming round a corner for the first time into this valley in Wales, and it was sort of overcast, wet, sort of autumnal day, and just being like quite overwhelmed by the place and the feeling. And I was on, and the fact that the bike had sort of taken me there, and it was also new and exciting, and I just remember sort of feeling so like affected by it in a positive way. If I could bottle this and give it to as many people as possible, then potentially be putting something amazing into the world.
From Escape Collective, this is Overnight Success, the podcast about the entrepreneurs, the personalities, and the passionate people who make up the sport of cycling and the stories behind the icons they've built. If you followed this podcast for long enough, you might realize that most of the brand stories I gravitate towards telling are ones that I have some sort of personal connection with. Whether I own the products they make and love them, or have an existing relationship within the company. This podcast is actually really tough for me to do a good job with if I have no connection with the business. Fortunately, I've met enough fascinating people in my time working in the bike industry that I have no shortage of stories that I want to share. This story about the apparel brand Albion is one such story. And my connection with them goes back before the founders were even in the bike industry. Back in 2015, I was spending a few days in the Spanish island of Mallorca riding my bike, and I bumped into two guys on the road named Charlie and Rupert, and I was wearing the jersey of my former business, Cycling Tips. They asked if I knew anyone who worked at Cycling Tips, and I told them I most certainly did. I rode with Charlie and Rupert for a couple days on Mallorca, and they excitedly told me about this new apparel brand they were creating. Charlie worked in PR, and Rup was a photographer, and I mean like an highly esteemed photographer who shot the likes of presidents and the royal family and such. I thought they had an interesting mix of talents to be able to create a brand. I loved their enthusiasm, but if I'm honest, I've heard this kind of story countless times before, and I left it as one of those fleeting encounters that I may or may not ever hear from again. But only a year later, I watched Albion launch, and I was so happy for them. Now, a decade later, after that bike ride on Mallorca, it's been an absolute pleasure to see Albion establish itself as a leading apparel brand who has supported and integrated itself into the ultra and adventure scene. A scene that's developed enormously over the past decade. Charlie, Rupert, and Jack have all known each other since their university days in Leeds, but it wasn't until they all moved to London that their friendship really formed on the bike. Pre-dawn rides before work, long weekend riding to and from Brighton, those rides sparked the first conversations about what would later become Albion. Like most people, they certainly enjoyed sunny tailwind days, but they weren't inspired by that glossy side of cycling. Albion grew from cold rides in Wales, and from a fascination with other outdoor brands, and from talking hours on the bike about what they wanted but couldn't find. Brands like Rapha were already setting the standard, but Jack, Charlie, and Rupert saw an opportunity to do something different. Something rooted in long days out, 3 seasons in a day, and British terrain. Charlie, can you tell me about some of those early rides that were pivotal to the formation of Albion in those early days?
There's quite a sort of well-known sort of rite of passage long ride that you do, which is like London to Brighton, which is sort of due south on the coast of England, and then back to London again. It's about 200k. And, at the time, the idea of a sort of 200k ride was like a sort of quite a big deal. And me and Rupert rode it together once, and we were kind of, it was that thing of we sort of was sussing each other out a little bit, keeping the pace quite honest. And then that actually became quite an important sort of very early element of the Albion story in terms of riding together on this route. We did it like quite a few times actually, and just really exploring the sort of the feeling of spending all day on the bike, long rides, quite sort of challenging. It wasn't that long after we started riding that we probably met you, Wade, actually,
Really?
in Mallorca,
Yeah.
and maybe a year or two.
Yeah.
But as you said, before you hit record, there's a sort of nice serendipity to the fact that we're having this conversation with you. And as you said, there isn't loads of stuff about Albion and our story out there, because we kind of have deliberately kind of kept our head down a little bit, really just tried to focus on, building a great brand and, all those things.
Before Albion, Rupert, Jack, and Charlie were working full-time in very different corners of the creative world: photography, advertising, and corporate PR. But outside of work, they shared one thing: a growing obsession with cycling and the gear that they needed for the kind of riding they were doing. As Jack says, they looked outside of the traditional cycling industry to find the brand identity they were seeking.
Back in those days, I think the inspiration was deliberately outside of cycling. I think we were really looking to other categories. Just to give you a bit of an example about how we would spend our time, me, Charlie, and Rupert, we all had day jobs. We all worked relatively long hours at times, but we were desperately trying to spend time out on our bikes. And so we were always talking about brands. We were always talking about kind of things we wanted to do. And a lot of what informed the types of brands we were thinking about were the trips we were going on. So we were heading to Wales, basically the three of us, in all of our available time, to the Elan Valley. And we were talking about the types of brands that could exist. And I think a big thing for us being in those places was taking inspiration really from the outdoor industry and the types of brands there. I think we were really inspired by Wales as a place at the beginning. I remember a first trip there with me, Charlie, and Rupert, and we walked in, we basically settled down, and we just went out and did long days every day. And we were talking about the types of products we needed. And I think the brands that spoke to us were ones that had clear identities probably in their home territories. So I think, Scandinavian outdoor brands, American outdoor brands, it felt like there was a much bigger scene there compared to maybe where cycling was at the time. I think cycling felt quite, what's the right word to use? Probably quite controlled. It felt like there was a set way of running a cycling brand or looking like a cycling brand, whereas I think the outdoor industry to us felt much more open. That was partly in types, in terms of literally national identity. In some ways, it was the performance of those brands. I think, many of those brands felt like they were light years ahead in terms of technology. So I think that really crystallized something in the beginning, which was, could you start a cycling brand? Could you start a cycling or an outdoor brand, which was designed for the types of riding that inspired us? And that really motivated us at the beginning. It's what kind of drove us back to this particular place in the Elan Valley, probably year after year, even before launching the brand. I remember we had trips there. Some of them were purely for riding. I remember the first time, I think we turned up there, and I remember quite ceremoniously Rupert threw a rug over the TV and said we won't be needing that this weekend. And it was this little bungalow we always stayed in. And that was followed by, long days out in probably one of the best places, one of our favorite places to ride a bike, where we would talk for hours about the type of brand we wanted to create. But whilst we obviously knew there were some fantastic cycling brands, we weren't really looking there as much probably as other industries. And I think that was probably where, you talk about white space. I think for us, we knew that there could be something different. I think that was my background as well with brands and positioning, and almost we went on a journey in trying to find our voice slightly. And I wouldn't say it was easy. we felt very passionate about space. We felt like there was this big insight about long days, about being outside, about what the bike meant to us, about kind of the way we were connecting around an area. So we were confident in that. But I think it takes a while to go from maybe that motivation through to actually having a product business. And I think, like, much to our great fortune, we underestimated that journey and how hard it would be, which is how we managed to get through it.
Jack, you just mentioned, you guys were kind of inspired by the places that you guys were drawn to and the environments and that, and where you like to be and where you like to ride. And I do notice that like a lot of your collateral on your website, on your marketing and stuff is like really tough conditions, right? That's what you guys really seem to build product for. Did you guys really enjoy riding in that type of stuff? Or is it you drawn to it because of the challenges that you get to sort of tackle with apparel? And I mean, Rupert, the photography in bad weather is so much better than good weather often. Are there elements that draw you to that bad weather, or am I imagining Wales unfairly?
I think you're right. I think you're right, to be honest. I mean, I think the thing about certainly the riding we were doing or the experiences we were having is we weren't searching out bad weather at all, but it's pretty hard to avoid. I think, if you go into certainly parts of Wales, or if you go into, mountainous regions in any part of the world, the weather changes quickly. And we used to talk a lot about that feeling of 3 seasons in a day. And yeah, I think in building a brand, maybe there is some drama in almost showing some of those adverse conditions. But for us, it was really just part and parcel of the riding we were doing. I think, maybe we were pushing against a little bit the fair weather world. I think, not that we don't all love riding our bikes in wonderful weather and having good days out, but I think, a lot of cycling maybe was about, riding in more traditional, maybe hot weather places. And for us, there was a real energy and a real kind of just love for us of being out in the elements, be it, any day of the year. I think, we have many Wales trips where we were riding in phenomenal weather, but I remember one December just getting a few days off work and heading with Rupert actually back to this place, to this bungalow in mid Wales. And we went out and we attempted this route, which we always did. And we completely underestimated what was going on out there. I remember Rupert took this photo of me at the time in completely inadequate gear as I was walking up this climb covered in snow. And this was a road ride. We were having these days out, which though just felt like the times of our lives. And I think everyone can relate to that. I don't think we were doing anything special. I think it's, I think from, anyone in the UK knows what that feels like. It doesn't have to be on a bike. It can be a long walk, with your family, or it could be anything. It could be, it could be a walk to school for some people, but big days out definitely inspired us. And I think the weather just was part and parcel of that.
And in some ways, in my mind anyway, that's almost like the sort of the first spark where it was like, okay, this is something so seemingly simple, riding your bike, is like very, very, very powerful and intoxicating. And it was like, okay, well, more people need to feel this.
If I could jump to June of 2015, this is where I met you, Charlie, and Rupert in Mallorca. And I was there for a bike launch, and I just spent a couple more days riding my bike around after it was all done, after traveling all that way. And my memory from that was you guys being really inspired by Gus and Lockie Morton's thereabouts. I remember you asking about it, and I'd love to meet those guys one day or whatever. And I think the next day we went riding, after the first day we met, you guys even came like in t-shirts or something like that, I remember, which was unheard of at the time, except for Lockie and Gus doing that. Like, you just wouldn't do that, even though it feels like yesterday and it's so commonplace now. That's what stood out to me. And did that spark anything in your guys' sort of start of cycling can be viewed differently than the traditional tight lycra and all that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I definitely remember from that day, Wade, is when we met up on the second day and we sort of agreed to meet, and like Charlie and I like massively undercooked the distance, and like you were very gentlemanly waiting in a cafe for us for probably like an hour.
Oh yeah, I remember. Yeah. I got a nice suntan that morning.
That's what sticks out in that day to me more than anything. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right that we were super inspired by those early thereabouts things, and I think a big part of it for me anyway was that like it just was different, right? You were just being sort of hit in the face by this different way of riding your bike, even though it was kind of like, you know, it's covering big miles and it's tough and it's all, but it was expressive, and it was you know, in a micro way bucking the tradition, right? And I might not have put it quite like that in those days, but I think, you know, that would probably be what maybe spoke to me, certainly, that people were just, you know, prepared to do something a little bit differently. And I think that felt a lot what we were trying to do. You know, I wasn't like trying to sort of deliberately be a contrarian or anything like that, but you know, we were riding in slightly different places to what we were being presented with the whole time, even though, of course, ironically, we met in Mallorca. But
yeah, I was going to
say. But yeah, that's I think it was just the sort of the difference, the sort of slightly cavalier attitude of it was inspiring, you know. You know, okay, a t-shirt might be an expression of that, but you know, it was just the idea that you didn't have to conform and do cycling in the exact same way that it's always been done, and adhere to rules and gatekeepers and all this sort of stuff, right? And that probably set off a bit of a chain, which, you know, led to finding our own voice and our own feet as to what that meant for us, or for us as individuals.
Sorry, I was going to say, but you'll remember the rules, you know, like it sort of feels antiquated now. That concept of like the rules, and I think we probably at anyone, you know, when we first got into it, you know, you're very aware of them and probably subscribing to loads of them, either consciously or unconsciously, and it always felt, I mean, it's funny to think that idea of the rules existed back then, which wasn't that long ago, but now they've kind of all been completely sort of exploded. But yeah, like back then, this kind of inherent tension of like how cycling looked and felt, and having to subscribe to some of that almost to fit in, whilst also really wanting to break a few of those rules and just, I think, be ourselves a bit more. And yeah, like I definitely think that the original Thereabouts film was a big inspiration, because there were these guys who were kind of just doing it in their own way, and you know, they had loads of character, and there was a sort of you know, just something about them, and it was almost the antithesis of the sort of head to toe sponsored Euro Pro vibe. So yeah, that was definitely a big influence, wasn't it, at the start?
So about a year later, after we met in Mallorca, and you guys were talking about this new brand you guys were going to create, and it was very excited for you, and especially when you first launched, to actually see it happen, because I hear a lot of these that don't happen, right? How do you guys go about designing those first products? Like, we just went through your sort of career backgrounds and that, and you guys have no product design experience or anything. What's your guys' recollection of like, how the heck do I design a waterproof phone pouch or or a long sleeve jersey for the brand you guys are envisioning? Charlie, maybe do you want to start talking about your memories about that?
I think, I guess the thing to say is, and this remains as true today as it did at the start, is that we are the customer. Whilst we didn't have the necessary or the specific product experience, we kind of did know what we wanted to make in terms of the type of product. At the start, you when in our position, certainly, you know, we definitely lent on our factory a little bit in that regard, in terms of product development. And
so you had a factory, you gave them the specs of kind of what you would like in that, and they would do it, and you would try it on, see if it's what you wanted, give them feedback. Is that kind of how that initial process, when you don't even have these relationships established, is that what it looks like at the beginning?
Yeah, exactly that. And I think, you know, it's funny, we've worked with one of our factories now for, it'll be 10 years next year from the sort of initial idea. And they talk about at the start it didn't even have the samples didn't even have a brand. It was just Charlie Stewart, because we started working in that way, where it was like literally just like this sort of almost like personal dialogue. We met them actually at a trade fair in Munich called Performance Days, which is like a big sort of industry fabric fair, which is where we actually also met Graham, which maybe we'll get to. But But yeah, we were introduced, we were sort of, me and Rupert got a red-eye flight out to Munich. We didn't know anything about anything. And we just turned up at this, and it was just a hall full of booths, people exhibiting fabrics. And we had no idea where to start, really. And we were just sort of wandering around in a bit of a daze because we'd had about 3 hours sleep. And this, one of the sort of sales reps for one of the fabric brands sort of put a pity on us, I guess, and just like he said, we're like, what are you looking for? And we were literally like, we just want to make some cycling kit. And he sort of frog marched us over to this booth where one of our factories was exhibiting, and we struck up a relationship.
That person they met at this trade show in Munich, her name is Graziella, and worked for an Italian apparel manufacturer called Stampiera Alisi.
2016, when we met Charlie and Rupert. I am not sure that Jack was already there. We met Jack later when they came to Italy. From that first contact, they said that they were going to start this business, that they wanted to start with just a few styles, that they could provide some design and so on. So we invited them that they see the factory. It was a good start, and little by little we helped them to grow, but also we liked the Albion spirit of being a very British brand with certain characteristic, and with people also that could have ideas that were a bit more advanced on the looking for in a different way to the market, just not for growing. And I don't want to say that everything was always very good and easy with them, because also they really needed to be more organized. I think that they were very always talking about what they want to produce, what they want to develop. For sure, for them, there is still this idea of, something personal. I think that they work quite well as a team. They are very good also trying to involve other people, because we knew that they try to have new ideas to work. But then the difficulty sometimes was to put all these and going to produce, to go into the product in a way that was not too difficult for its part.
We've been so lucky on our journey of like all sorts of people that we've crossed paths with, and like you would be one of them, Wade, who just like for whatever reason we've just like through I think very genuine means, like whether because we're riding our bikes or you meet somebody at a fair, like we've been really lucky to just sort of like strike really good bonds and relationships with people that have allowed us to probably have people help us in ways that were probably not befitting of who we were at the time. And I think maybe we should take credit as a three as friends, and how we treat people maybe, and how we are with each other, that for some reason we've been lucky enough to have all sorts of people come in and out of our universe, and so as Charlie said, we had none of the technical bits, but somehow through their desire to help us, their patience, and other people that then came in along the way who did have some expertise, and we've been, and I think as well, like I think we've always been very honest with each other and about what we know and what we don't know. You know, like we're all like we all give ourselves over to higher knowledge like every day, right? You know, it's like there's not too much ego knocking about in that sense. Like we will, you know, whether it's to each other or to a colleague or to somebody else, you know, I think we know how to listen, and I think or not try and think we know it all, you know. And so maybe that sort of allowed some of these things to develop. We allowed ourselves to be guided a little bit rather than just dictating stuff we didn't know on day zero.
It's interesting because that answers my next question, which was going to be, there's a lot of fake it till you make it in starting a business, right? You might approach some of these suppliers or factories with, a bit of confidence. Here's what we're going to do. And it doesn't sound like you guys approached it that way from what you're saying. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. And I think, I think because we probably couldn't, like as Charlie said, like when we first walked into that, that exhibition center in Munich. I mean, we knew a little south of nothing really. And I suppose it's just being able to form a few bonds here and there and listen to people and be listened to, that you sort of find yourself in front of somebody that help. Yeah. But we were definitely on a journey, right? From zero. And I don't think, whilst we believed, and I think Jack would probably be able to speak more powerfully about this, but we believed in what we were trying to do in the sense of the insight, the places, the conditions, the mindset, the customer. We were that. We knew what we wanted. We just we obviously just couldn't articulate it technically at that moment.
Jack, tell me how the launch went when you launched those 3 products. You probably were sitting there with anticipation when you did push out the campaigns, put the website live and everything. What's your recollection of how you guys felt when you went live with it all? How did it go?
I mean, we were on top of the world, to be honest. It was simpler times. I think, we lived, I think for the first few years, actually, we lived and breathed. We were almost living and dying, season to season. I think it was quite hand to mouth. Like, it was at that point, just the 3 of us. And, we'll come on to talk about who Rupert's alluded to. There's an incredible team in place now, and how we work couldn't be more wildly different. But at the beginning, I think it was pretty life and death. It was right. We're going to buy this product and we're going to do it however we need to, whether, we were paying for it ourselves, but whether we were doing stuff on credit cards or we would, however we would make it happen, we were going to buy that product from the factory. And we were going to sell that product and we were going to go again. So, there wasn't a lot of time in between those transactions taking place. You kind of had to sell the product quickly. And we were working on very short lead times at that point with the factory. I mean, kind of scarily short lead times looking back on it. But that was how it went. So the first launch, I mean, that product sold. I think, it was, we were always running it in that way. We bought the product and we sold it all. And we were quite quickly, obviously, heading into spring, summer. But at that time, it was so much about trying to bottle what the brand meant more than anything else. I think, no one in the world knew what Albion meant. Still today, I think we're there's a lot of people who are still to find out about Albion, but back then it was a constant daily struggle to almost try and bring the brand to life through as many areas as we could. And it wasn't just products. So we had the website. And I think if you were to go back on the Albion website back in 2016, 2017, it had 2 main sections. It had the log and it had the products. So the products were there. And there weren't a lot of launches. It was one big seasonal launch. But the log was a constant challenge of trying to bring these stories and these products to life. And I think that's what kind of kept us really busy as well. We almost saw ourselves at the beginning as part content machine, part product business. But because of the time it takes to develop products, and we were developing certain products for a long time and not bringing them to market. I think, we couldn't bring the excitement in a way a brand does when it's, more fully evolved with lots of product launches and lots of stories there. I think a lot of it had to be about the narrative, and it had to be about riding in certain conditions. And almost, I think that was the funny thing at the beginning is, whilst we may all have, quite clear roles now, at the beginning, we were all doing everything. We were all storytellers in our own way. We were all working on the product, and it felt like the most serious thing in the world. It was the three of us just trying to string this thing along, trying to prove to everyone that we could do it. And it was a real thing. And I think, to Rupert's point on factories and stuff, it involved bringing everyone along on the journey. You had to keep the factory sweet, however you could at that point, with small sized orders. And, we couldn't be more grateful for those early factory partners actually for allowing those types of orders to be made. I'm not sure if you could do it in the same way today. But it was also trying to tell stories that were maybe a bit beyond our size. And I think, one of the things I really look back to on the launch, and I think we all still look to, was that very clear identity that really Rupert brought to the brand. It all came through one lens. It all came through Rupert. And I think that it did allow us to feel a bit bigger. So if we were telling stories in Wales or wherever we might be, it was all looking quite Albion in the sense, that was in many ways trying to bring this feeling of being outdoors through the photography was a big challenge. And then the product itself was very pared back. I mean, it still is in many ways today quite understated, but you should have been able to you could see it was Albion with some quite clear brand design from a distance. But yeah, that in a nutshell was not just the launch, but the first few years.
Yeah, that first campaign, where I was looking at it the other day, actually randomly, it still stacks up. Like, I still like it, and so that's good. But yeah, we launched with it was like a drab olive green jersey, right? And I remember at the time, it felt like, I remember, even in 2016, the internet was probably a lot more sort of docile place, and I remember somebody sort of making a comment about, oh yeah, that's safe, like a dark green jersey, sort of thing. And you're kind of like, oh, and it's like a dagger in your heart. And actually, you look back on it now and go, oh, well, it's great. I stand by it. It's like different or whatever.
This podcast is fully funded by our members at Escape Collective. In fact, all of our content on our website and our podcast network is 100% supported by our members who believe that cycling media should be independent from the sport and industry we cover, and that we should exist to serve you rather than live or die by our ability to be a platform for the sole purpose of selling you more stuff. If you enjoy this podcast or any of our other work and believe in our mission of independence, please go to escapecollective.com/join and become a member today. Thank you for your support. Charlie, how were you guys funding this at the time? And were you guys all still working your jobs when you first went to launch?
We all put in a small amount. I think it was about £3,000 each or something like that at the start. Most of that went on the product, basically. We had quite a lot of the sort of the creative production skills, I guess, within the group, in terms of, certainly photography was a huge part of that, which could have been a big cost if we didn't have that. And I think copywriting, between myself and Jack, that was definitely something that we had in our armory and enjoyed doing. And then obviously the website was an important element. We had, through some friends, to get someone to work on something good and it not break the bank.
Was that a bespoke website, or were you able to use a Shopify style type of service?
When we started, actually, it was a sort of WordPress front end and a Shopify back end, which worked pretty well for the first few years. There definitely came a moment when that was sort of holding us back more than it was doing anything else. And now we have a fully integrated Shopify website with a bespoke front. But
yeah. Because at one time that could have cost $1 million, right? So
there definitely were brands who had a pretty simple website and an effective Instagram presence, and you were able to build an entire business and explode and make, sell lots of product literally by just Instagram and a simple website. So, but yeah, the startup was relatively simple. We obviously had to design a brand, and that was something that we did put a bit of the money into. And I think and we were very adamant that we needed a strong brand identity. And I remember Jack, this was something that he had some experience in, and I think we were very clear that we needed like a couple of elements, like a graphic element to the brand that wasn't just the name. And so the line, the Albion line has become a bit of a thing, and people always ask us about it. And I think it's really strong actually, and stands up really, really well.
And what is the Albion line? Can you describe it for people listening?
I knew you were going to ask me that question. As soon as I mentioned it, I knew you'd ask. The truth is that it's an ambiguous symbol. It's supposed to be evocative of. It could be a route. It could be a coastline. The edge of a map. And what's quite interesting actually is that lots of people either think they know what it is, or will email us asking about it in a way that suggests that they've kind of already made up their mind that it's something. And actually, I think that's really interesting. I think we all collectively think that's really interesting. This idea that something like that could be very evocative, and if it's a route to you, then fantastic. If it's making you feel something, and it's eliciting a strong emotion, then it's kind of doing its job. We will be asked about the Albion line until our dying day. I think it continues to intrigue people.
Well, we're on the questions of you've had to answer many times. Maybe Jack, can you describe how the name Albion came about and what it meant to you, and the conversations, and maybe even some of the throwaway names that ended up leading to that? Do you remember?
Oh wait, I don't know if we can give you this exclusive. No, I think yeah, we went on a big journey with the name. I mean, we struggled with it at the start. I mean, we would really agonize over it. I remember having long afternoons with Charlie and Rupert, and it actually took us going back to Wales and where it all started to come up with the name. We'd had a couple of names along the way in the journey. But I think what was cool was there was a very clear playbook and a very clear identity for cycling brands at the time. There were these loads of amazing brands out there who all had really clear European identities, back from kind of the historic brands to the modern brands, regardless of where they came from. I think, there was this strong European identity. And I think that gave us something really natural to push up against. We knew then that we could do something very different. So kind of harking into that area, I think, a lot of the riding we were doing at that time was in Britain. I think we wanted quite a strong name. So we had lots of different names that were inspired. It could be using Welsh language, it could be using kind of place, history. But Albion came to us after a weekend, believe it or not, of riding and trying to come up with a name. We were heading home, and it just came out on the journey home in the car. And it stuck, I think. And we started then talking about Albion probably for the next 6 months, and it's never gone away. So luckily, yeah, we got to that name. I mean, the meaning of it really is it's the oldest name for the island of Great Britain, as you probably know. But I think there was something in that where it wasn't overt, to an international audience. I think Albion can just be a strong word. But there is that connection, I think, to place as well, which we liked.
Do you remember when you guys quit your jobs and made that leap? Was that right at launch, or was that a time after?
That was a couple of years after. So it was interesting because Rupert was sort of freelance, and he can talk a bit more to this, but we're essentially we're keeping the stock at his house or his flat and fulfilling from there. He was going to the post office, and so we sort of had that element of Rupert being a bit more flexible. And then both me and Jack, I think I was able to change jobs and take a job that still pays quite well, but less day, 4 days a week. But they knew about Albion, which was my fifth day. So it was this kind of sort of interesting tension. I worked there for a year, and they were great, but it was almost that sort of slightly odd dynamic of I was doing 4 days a week for them and 1 week on Albion, but I was kind of also working on Albion like sort of almost the whole time.
Yeah.
So it was always a sort of a temporary solution as I sort of phased into going full time. But I think managing it like that, going from full time to sort of less time, to then going full time, definitely sort of de-risked it, certainly from my point of view. And then, yeah, obviously, Jack, you followed a bit later.
Our ability to have jobs and keep earning in those early days, I think, allowed us also to make the right decisions, because if we'd suddenly had 3 mouths to feed and everything that goes with it, we would have actually limited ourselves, because we wouldn't have been able to bring in the other areas of talent that we needed. I mean, I wouldn't like want to do it again. And I think it was, it was hard at times. It really was like working a day job and then working a night shift, and all holidays or annual leave, was away working on Albion. It was either factory trips or it was photo shoots. So like those years were quite, they were exciting, but we were definitely pushing it quite hard. But yeah, I think it worked in our way. I think, we were talking earlier about technology and how you start a business. We were lucky in the timing. It was right when you could do a lot of things online. So, we had obviously the website running where we could take all our orders. You have your accountancy online. We were using, like everyone, Meta to advertise the business. I think, there was quite a full-on package there. And I think the really hard yards were what you got up and did in the morning. So, I think that was really, really tough at times for Rupert, where to actually deliver every single package and to try and run a customer service operation was not pretty. And I remember at one point when, Rupert had he had some big life stuff to deal with. And I remember taking over fulfillment around Christmas time whilst having a job. And I literally had to just not do my job. I was going out to the post office the entire time. We were trying to take orders. So I had the 1-bedroom flat I was living at the time in with my wife, or my girlfriend at the time, was just full of boxes of stock. And, this was like completely normal to us in a way that I would hate to see us try and do that again. It just wouldn't work with life. But at the time, because it's just growing organically, you don't question the decisions you're making. And if it got really busy, I'd go around to Rupert's. We lived a short trip away from each other, and we would do some packing at night. So that was kind of what it felt like at the beginning.
I used to go to the local post office, and that was before even like drop and go. I literally queued in the thing, and you knew which days it'd be like, oh, this is the day people go in and pay their electricity bills, or this is the day when people get their like social security checks, and so the queue's going to be long, and it would be like she'd fill out all literally doing one at a time at the window, and then you'd sort of get back home, and it was always about timing it, because you'd get back home and then there'd be like another order or something. You're like, oh, and then obviously that's a great thing. You're like, oh, you got to pack another thing up. Yeah, like Jack says, it's like looking back on it now, it's like, how on earth was that even a consideration, or doable? Yeah, my memory of the transition was, as Charlie said a second ago, that because I had a little bit more flexibility and I wasn't having to quit a job in that sense. I think originally we were like, I could carry on working a little bit, and so it would put less financial pressure on us, if you know what I mean, which is amazing in itself, that we were even able to have those conversations. The idea that I would, that's how much sort of support and trust we were giving each other. It would almost be like, and then what that time was end of 19, early 20, and I have this memory of being a big, like, COVID was just starting, right? But it hadn't like gone full on, and I was at this like big, I used to occasionally have to photograph like horse racing, and I was at like a big like horse racing thing, and at that time I think these guys had both fully left their jobs, right? And there was this idea that I was still going to be doing some work and stuff, and then obviously bang, COVID, lockdown, and it just drew this massive indelible line, across all of our lives. And it kind of, like that was the original plan, and COVID just tore it up, because there was suddenly this almost like circuit breaker in the way you'd been living your life, and the things like, oh, obviously, like, you're not going to work, or I wasn't going to work because of lockdown and all this sort of stuff. So it kind of like, it artificially forced. And then by the time we came to the end of that period, it was like, no, okay, this needs the three of our collective powers, and the fact that I had that disruption to my routine, and obviously, like, you know, seeing where all the cards landed after COVID was, you know, in an already disruptive space, was kind of even more so. And it kind of felt like, no, okay, right, you know, this is my opportunity to make a change, if you know what I mean. The change has almost been made for me. And so that's how I kind of remember that transition into us going from it being like something we were doing on the side of our jobs to all of us it being our jobs.
By the time we got to 2019, we were all about to get onto the business full time. The machine was more up and running at that point, and I think there are a couple of really big changes that happened. So around that point, we met Graham.
The Graham that Jack refers to is a gentleman named Graham Rayburn. Graham was Rapha's head designer during the company's formative years, and he is very highly regarded in the apparel design space.
A year and a bit after I'd left Rapha, November 2018, I think, I'd been to a trade show in Munich, Performance Days, completely focused on both sports, but also sustainable materials and future of circularity within clothing, and particularly outdoor performance clothing. And I was introduced to two of the team coming back at the airport. There was a mutual friend of ours introduced us, and he said to me, "Oh, you should meet these guys at Albion, blah blah blah." We got chatting, and you know, it just went from there. I could see an opportunity at Rayburn. We had this big studio space that was open as a store in London. It was open at the weekends for retail. So the studio sort of transformed into a retail space. And we had the luxury of space in there, and I kind of started developing this idea of having inviting people in, brands with similar values, to do a rail takeover, to do a pop-up within, and have this crossover of different communities and worlds. And I floated the idea with Albion and said, look, would you like to come and take over a space? We could do a weekend of kind of cycle related things. You can curate whatever you'd like to do in there. And this sort of got a little bit of momentum. So I think we did 2 or 3 of these events where there was range launches. We would have interesting bikes on display, film screenings. There was a night about the Sonkols Challenge, and Phil Deaker was presenting on that. And so we got a nice little bit of momentum there. And I was really impressed with what the guys were doing. They were, clearly thinking, a few steps ahead of the industry in a way that maybe there was, that certainly spoke to me, I guess, as a designer. And it just went from there, really. Yeah.
Tell me how that, maybe the mindset of them, or what was a few steps ahead, because my understanding was they were just 3 guys trying to figure it out, right? And meanwhile, someone like yourself had been doing this for years. How were they a little bit ahead?
At the heart, what there was, all of the materials were recycled or in some way trying to be a more sustainable thing. And so at the heart of it, and this was kind of almost unquestioned. It wasn't like the leading thing, we're going to change the world by making sustainable cycle wear. It was, we're going to make brilliant cycle wear, but actually way down inside it was using the most responsible materials at this point in time. So that was actually really refreshing and engaging for me. It was underpinned with the free repairs for life for the garments. So actually we did some repair workshops in the Rayburn lab, where actually the provocation there was we were doing it for any brand cycle wear. So this was, as I say, a provocation to the industry that more brands, or there should be better services, better support if you have damaged clothing, whether in a crash or through kind of durability issues. And they were completely on board with that. And some of the products as well were they were not sort of homogenized kind of sublimated race jerseys. There was a desire to make interesting insulated garments for, in this case, sort of the British conditions for riding in the British Isles. So it wasn't hot, beautiful hot switchbacks in the Alps, under glorious sunshine. There was the very pragmatic approach, I think, to riding in the UK.
So you met them, you did some launches in your space, and where did it go from there?
I'd been helping a few bits and pieces with Charlie, Rupert, and Jack, but I was careful. I didn't want to get too involved because I think they were doing a brilliant job as they were. Like I was kind of try to be hands off. If they needed technical help fitting something or whatever, it was great. I was more than happy, but I didn't want to kind of rock the boat or anything. Officially, I joined them in 2021, the new year 2021, and have been fully on board ever since.
What was the impetus for you to actually formally become a part of Albion? They did say to me that you've also invested in the business as well. Like that's a big step in both career and your personal situation. How did that come about?
There's never been any doubt in my mind that over what they were doing, what they were creating, the direction of the brand at all. I had complete confidence in them. I have been involved in sort of tentatively, taking on more hours just as a way to actually, even though I've sort of fully committed in lots of other ways, but in order to ensure that it's a harmonious sort of escalation of the commitment. I have absolutely no doubt, and I'm all in. So and I think I'm doing my best work I've ever done. And in fact, that's probably quite one of the things that we hit it off on quite early on was around the time of that first pop-up. I was like, well, I've got this idea I've been sitting on for a while that's too good, if you guys want to do something with it. And I'd worked on this kind of concept of a little insulated chest protector thing that is perfect for cold starts and like descents. If you climb a mountain, you got a chilly descent potentially, and using modern materials to replicate what those newspapers used to do, in the European mountains, stuffed down the front of a cycling jersey and taken out at the bottom when it's got warmer. And so I'd made up a bunch of these samples and hadn't gone anywhere previously. I said, well, listen, if you want to use this, then please do, because I think it's someone's got to do something with it. And they got behind it. But the biggest challenge, we were searching for a name for it for ages, for months, like agonizing, and it's sort of like the chest pillow or like the wind protector, and nothing really tripped off the tongue. And then suddenly realized, like, there it was, like staring me in the face in my surname, and so the burner came into existence, and it was just sort of like this flash.
Okay, of course, the burner.
I think things like that, and like we were doing, we could chuck these ideas, have these conversations, make an idea. We had this, we make these like micro musettes, again, like reinterpretations of classic parts of classic cycling accessories or part of the cycling wardrobe, that are these little musettes made from technical fabrics that fold down to something minuscule that can go in the bottom of a jersey pocket. But you go to a food stop, go into a store, and you're refueling, it's 20 grams or something like that. So again, they got behind ideas like that, and it was just a very fluent, natural way to work together.
I'm learning lots here. You guys were designers, marketers, salespeople, everything. You three up until relatively recently, hey? And then you must have been limited in what you could do, not only by maybe knowledge, imagination, and everything, but like technical skill set. Is that safe to assume until you brought people like Graham and Rhiannon on board?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's that we were very sort of, from a product point of view, we were sort of rough around the edges, I think, at the start. So the insight was there and the ideas were there, but our ability to execute them perhaps wasn't as refined, just because we didn't know how. But it became apparent pretty quickly that was some sort of expertise and skill set that we kind of needed in the room. And I think, to go back to Rupert's point that he was making before about, I think it's really important to be aware of and to know what you don't know, and be humble about that. And I think it's something that served us well, actually really well with Albion, because we've always had, passion and excitement and enthusiasm for the idea, but we've also been acutely aware that we're going to need lots of help to realize that. And I think that translates into the way that we build relationships, the way we work with people, because we're aware that, without these people, we don't have a brand. So, it's basically, it's going to be, it has been and will continue to be an exercise in getting more and more expertise into the room, to help us and supersede us. But I would also say that I think at the very start, kind of doing everything, or like trying to do everything and having an understanding of like how things work, sets you up quite well to then bring in people who can help you and do it better. Because if you understand broadly, their role or their area, you might not know everything about their area. And definitely, the beauty is when you bring in people who can, add way more than you ever could, but also kind of knowing and having been there a little bit definitely helps us, I think, understand, for example, where there are areas that we might need, the next area of sort of assistance and yeah.
And has in-house designers like Graham, Rhiannon, having them around, have those opened doors to different suppliers? For example, Pertex. It seems like just as a small show, you probably couldn't get in there, I'm guessing.
We were looking to build out the range, and we wanted to make some products that sort of spoke perhaps like, even more overtly to the sort of outdoor crossover. And it was around about the time that, sort of, ultra distance racing was becoming more prominent. There were more races, more coverage of those types of things. And it was quite interesting. You would see people on those events, they were using sort of outdoor brand products, Arc'teryx shells and this type of thing. And we were just sat there being like, surely a cycling brand must be able to make better products for this type of stuff than this. So that was actually quite a big insight for our Zoa range, which is a range of sort of it's off bike clothing, it's on bike clothing, it sort of crosses over into sort of outdoor gear. It's designed for mountainous terrain, ultra racing, and we needed a really technical fabric supplier to work with on that range. And Pertex has a really rich history in the outdoor industry, and the British outdoor industry. And actually, that if you dig into their customer base, they make products. Well, they make fabrics for some of the best brands in the world. And so we were like, okay, well, this would be interesting to work with them on this range potentially, because they had that brand, that they had a strong brand, that they had some name recognition, and we felt that together perhaps this might elevate elevate the products. The sort of the technology of the products was not in question. They make amazing fabrics, and it corresponded at a time when I think they were looking to push a bit more into cycling, having not really done much in cycling for many years. We've gone on to, really deepen the relationship with Pertex, and you actually see it. You do see it quite a lot now in cycling, but I think we were definitely of this sort of new wave of products and brands that started around that time. I think we were definitely sort of early on that, and I think a big part of that was totally having Graham and Rhiannon in our team. Having Graham can begin a conversation with any supplier.
Rupert, I'll ask you this question. Anyone else can jump in, but you do see a lot of cycling brands in general, apparel brands. They're always tempted by the allure of going to the world tour. And you guys, from the outside, seem to have carved out a really, really good focused space for yourselves, as in the adventure ultra side of things. How do you guys think about the space of the world tour sponsorships and getting a jersey in the Tour de France and all that? Is that something that is at all crossed your mind and thought that would be a cool place to play in, or is that just like not appealing to you whatsoever?
Historically, that's a part of cycling that we all love and continue to love, and watching the races, the spring classics and all that sort of stuff. It's but I think, like as Jack just said, it's like we've become so focused on what we're doing and where Albion sits that almost those two things can coexist. Like I can enjoy and love watching Paris-Roubaix and et cetera, but that doesn't change at all where Albion's at, if you know what I mean. And I think we've partnered with this year, which these guys will talk about, I'm sure, some really exciting races, the Mountain Series races and the Transcontinental and all these things. And in many ways, like that is kind of like the pinnacle of this side of the sport, and like some of the athletes that we are working with and some of the things they're doing, it's kind of like it's an incredible frontier, cutting edge, almost like pro tour level, that sort of, it's the equivalent of. And I think we have to be, well, we're so excited about that. Last year, one of our ambassadors, Justina Slavica, he sort of broke the Tour Divide record, the down from Banff down to the Mexican border, what was considered a fairly untouchable record within the Grand Depart. And the sort of the excitement of being able to have aligned with somebody doing something like that in that type of environment, and then the products obviously the team have created to put on the backs of these people. I think like that is our pro tour. That is like there's so much exciting fertile ground around these, and increasingly, as you see in this space of ultra endurance racing, and gravel racing is kind of this almost like bridge between the worlds at the moment. But like you get more of these like either just retired world tour pros or whatever that might kind of dip their toe into these other worlds. And it's so I feel like where we are and where we're concentrated is more than enough for us to sort of dream of, and the sort of whether it's a race or an athlete or an achievement, that is kind of our pro tour.
I'd say the pro tour analogy is such a good kind of essay question to ask any brand really in cycling, because it probably does say a lot about the development journey you're on. If you're creating a bike, you're going to be a very different company if you're heading for the pro tour than if you're heading for, say, like a downhill mountain bike or whatever it might be. I think for us, it's easier almost to look at, weirdly, at trail running as an analogy right now, because I think pro cycling it's been through such a journey in the last 30, 40 years. And, there are brands who are heavily involved in that. But I think with trail running, there's quite a neat analogy, which is there's two types of people who take part. There's the really competitive person who'll be racing and picking up kind of points to go and do something and really compete at the thick end of things. And we know now that's a seriously commercial side of the sport. It's 20 years ahead of where ultra racing is. There's big contracts, there's teams. So there's a really competitive element to what we think is, this world of ultra, of, bike pack racing. which is probably similar to the professionalization of trail running. And how fast cycling gets there, or whether it should get there eventually, is a big debate for another time. I think, we could talk about that for hours, the professionalization of something which is really quite pure. But then there's also the individual element to it. And I think that really talks to us, the individual pursuit of going out and riding. And it can almost feel like there's a huge performance element to it, even if you're only doing it for yourself. And that might be because you're trying to visit a particular place or travel across a certain landmass. But what I think is interesting is when you follow that analogy through, is that probably trail running was the bottom of a lot of running companies' lists early on. It was like, right, marathon's the sport. We need to create a shoe for marathon, okay? We can see millions of people, men and women all across the world, are taking part in these big cities, and this is the way that we build a brand. But what trail running was doing was quite different. And I think cycling, it's not going on a wildly different journey there, where, the equivalent of marathon, if we want to use that in pro sport, I hope will still be here forever. And I think it's, it's going to have to develop a lot, and the sport's going to have to modernize. And there's huge changes that we'll leave to other people to make on that side of the sport, because we're not experts there. But I think the bit that is changing rapidly, and I think can be so much more broad in its openness to new entrants as well, is bike packing and ultra racing, because I think it's something which anyone can get involved at a certain degree. I think there's a lot of barriers in place around kit, which obviously we see ourselves as part of there. But actually, once you're into it, it's an unbelievable thing to be part of, and I think that's why we're throwing our energy into. But
we have some amazing athletes, and lots of them go and win the most difficult races in this space. But it's not just about that, and actually people's character and who they are, and that matters to us as well. And we're really trying to build a group of people who embody the spirit of our brands outside the longer, and that's definitely about so much more than just winning.
Something else I wanted to ask you about, I think it was you, Charlie, who said at the beginning of the conversation that this is the story of Albion is largely a story of patience. And I'm learning that throughout this. One of the temptations a lot of businesses and founders find themselves getting drawn into is just the raising a lot of money, seeing all the competitors grow really, really fast. And, you guys are said in the same breath as many of those brands who are really thriving, and they've raised a bunch of money and they're opening stores everywhere and so forth. Do you guys find yourselves having conversations of what that might look like for you guys, or is that not a direction you want to go, or how do you see that? And maybe I'll leave it to any of you to answer that.
Albion's lucky in that we do have a small group of investors. Included in that group actually is Graham Rayburn, who's one of the investors. But we're lucky. We're not. We don't have VC or private equity backing. We've got a small group of people who are all passionate cyclists. Some of them actually were our customers, and that was the way we met them, and they got in touch with us in that sense. But yeah, we are still operating on a very different model and a very different playing field, I guess, to some of the bigger brands out there. And I don't think that's to our advantage or disadvantage. I just think we're on a slightly different pathway there, where I think if, when you are as big as maybe some of the competition, it comes with other pressures and other demands. And I think you can do huge things at scale and have a big impact, but also, it comes with problems too. And I think maybe we were lucky in just the speed of our growth that we were able to come through the pandemic and not see maybe the huge bounce that others felt, where, maybe you were buying, just a lot of surplus stock during that period. Now, I think for us, we're on a journey, and we want to be, a big brand and reach lots of people. But I think we're just doing it in our own way in that sense.
The investment that you guys have raised is, I know that your business in the apparel industry is very cash flow intensive, and the product, development cycles can take a long time. Even though you said yours is different, is that mainly what you guys deploy the investment towards? Is a cash flow and product development and so forth?
By its very nature, Albion, what we're trying to do, the type of brand we're trying to be, where we're trying to reach people, you do need to be in the field and seeing people. So a big part for us is you'll see us at the races. if we're not riding them, we'll be there on the finish line. We'll be doing repairs. We'll be hosting rides at shops. It's really about trying to grow the presence. But we're doing that still in, I guess, quite a slow way. The focus at the moment is doing that in Europe. But it's going well at the moment. I think, meeting customers, meeting real riders, being at these races has a huge impact. And I think when you're repairing products on the finish line of someone who's wearing a different brand, you quickly establish that relationship. You learn about products, you learn about people. And I think, the team only grows and benefits from that. But yeah, predominantly the investment has been used in, it's future facing investment. It's really trying to grow the business behind the scenes, not just on buying products.
It sounds like you guys are going about everything very intentionally, and not a lot of these problems are money problems, right? It's they can be solved without money, but if you have the money, you will spend it, and it sounds like you guys are very much not about that. Maybe as a final closing question, I'd love to ask each of you, and maybe it's the same answer, maybe it's slightly varied, but where do you see Albion in 10 years?
I have to really believe that kind of the pathway we're on at the moment and what we're so focused on in the sort of, the medium term around the partnerships, around the types of product we're making, the customer we want to make them for. I really think that there's so much to do there. That almost I find it hard to look beyond that. And I think if we've got anywhere close to, impacting those people and being a part of, the next phase of this side of the sport, I think that will probably land us in an interesting and perhaps even exciting place, in 10 years, if that's the timescale you want to talk about. But I think that solving the problems of today and answering the question for this type of riding and these types of environments and accessing those people and those customers, is an awful lot to be getting on with and kind of to be doing, and that will take however many years of kind of almost business as usual, if you like.
I think that's a very honest answer, and perhaps it is an unfair question because I couldn't answer that about my business either, to be honest, right? You don't know where the world is going to be, and you kind of 3 years is probably all you can see into the future, and that's probably only 2 product lines down the road, right? So, yeah,
that was something a point I was going to make, which is we're sort of already working further and further into the future where we have ideas for products that are not able to be in the timeline yet because they need to sort of join the queue. But I think from a product point of view, we really feel almost at the very beginning of the journey in terms of what we could do, the amount of amazing products that we could make for our customer that would improve the riding experience. And I think that will be a sort of never-ending journey, really, because technology moves on, and something like, for example, the way that aero in the world tour has kind of exploded in the last few years, and is driving a lot of the development there. Trends will come in, and I think in long distance riding, I'm interested to see what happens with that, and actually it's something we're thinking about, but yeah, I think looking into the future, there's so much. Stay Outside for Longer is so big, and it can encompass so much that it's really about continuing to put the blocks on top of each other to the point where we can just continue to find new people to inspire, and continue to grow. And yeah, I'm sure there'll be phases where that happens quicker than others, and that's fine. I think we want to be quite, we do want to be measured, but we also are very ambitious about how big this could be. And we don't feel limited in that capacity. I think from a product point of view, we're already competing with some of the biggest names in the industry, and we're a very small team in a room. So, in that sense, the possibilities are very, very big and very, very exciting.
The couple things that I've taken from the Albion story is that authenticity isn't born in a boardroom. It's built on the bike, and it's such an important ingredient for what they're trying to do. Also, playing the long game is about patience, and often time is what's needed to solve many of business's challenges, not money. Being humble, asking for help, and surrounding themselves with more capable people when necessary is such an important quality to succeed. Because no matter what any social media influencer tells you on Instagram, nothing is quick and easy money, and very few people are able to build a business alone. It's been a privilege and pleasure following Albion 10 years later after first bumping into Charlie and Rupert on the roads of Mallorca, where the idea was still being formed. And nearly a decade on, their impact on the community far outweighs their size and resources. This is Wade Wallace, and you're listening to Overnight Success from Escape Collective. This episode was produced by Red Bricks Media and music composed by Ashley Deneef. Thanks for listening.